Everyone remembers the Bad Tour as a spectacular success. Record-breaking. History-making. The kind of achievement that would eventually be written into music history forever. But there is one question almost nobody asks. What if those incredible records were built on something much darker? What if the tour that cemented Michael Jackson as the greatest entertainer alive was also the moment that quietly began destroying him from the inside? Because there is something the history books rarely focus on. Somewhere during the long run of the Bad Tour, there came a concert, a moment, a night when something changed. The audience never saw it. The cameras never captured it. But behind the curtain of what appeared to be the greatest show on earth, Michael Jackson's body was beginning to send warnings that nobody around him wanted to hear. And if you know exactly where to look, you can identify the point when the Bad Tour stopped being only a triumph and began turning into something far more disturbing, a slow-motion physical collapse unfolding behind the scenes. Stay with us, because even if you have followed Michael Jackson's story for decades, even if you believe you know every detail of the Bad era, what was really happening behind this tour is not the story most people were told. And once you understand it, everything that came afterward begins to look different. To understand what the Bad Tour may have cost Michael Jackson, you first have to understand the enormous weight he was already carrying before he performed a single show. By 1987, Michael Jackson was no longer simply the most famous musician alive. He had reached a level of global recognition that had almost no comparison in the history of popular culture. Thriller had sold more than 40 million copies worldwide by that point. He had completely redefined what a pop album could become, what a music video could achieve, and what audiences expected from a live performer. But that success created a terrifying new problem. The standard Michael Jackson had set was now so impossibly high that the entire music industry was watching to see whether even he could reach it again. Then, in August 1987, Bad arrived. What followed was something American chart history had never seen before. 5 consecutive #1 singles from one album: I Just Can't Stop Loving You, Bad, The Way You Make Me Feel, Man in the Mirror, and Dirty Diana. Every one of them reached the top of the Billboard Hot 100. The album would eventually sell more than 35 million copies worldwide. By every commercial measurement available, Bad was an extraordinary success. But something else was happening at the same time. The press that had once placed Michael Jackson on an untouchable pedestal during the Thriller years was beginning to circle him. The comparisons became relentless. Was Bad really as good as Thriller? Could anything ever be? And Michael Jackson, the most famous man on earth, had to carry the weight of that question every single day. On June 29, 1987, his manager, Frank Dilio, formally announced what would become Michael's first solo world tour. It was sponsored by Pepsi, a detail that carried a painful irony considering what a Pepsi commercial had done to him only 3 years earlier. The Bad World Tour was designed to become the largest solo touring operation in history. 16 months, 15 countries, 123 concerts, and eventually, an audience totaling approximately 4.4 million people. The production was so technically complex that it required a dedicated logistics operation simply to move the massive staging equipment from one city to another. Nothing on this scale had ever been attempted by a solo artist before. And at the center of the entire machine stood one man. Michael Jackson had to power all of it. The Bad Tour opened in Japan on September 12, 1987. The first 9 concerts sold out within hours, forcing organizers to add 5 more dates almost immediately just to meet the extraordinary demand. More than 600 journalists arrived at Narita International Airport simply to document Michael's arrival. Across those first 14 Japanese dates, approximately 450,000 people attended the shows. At a time when 200,000 concertgoers in a single country was considered a landmark achievement for almost any artist, Michael had more than doubled it. He was no longer simply popular. He had entered a category that did not even have a name. And if one place captures the true scale of what was happening, it was Wembley Stadium in London during the summer of 1988. Approximately 504,000 people passing through the gates. A record-breaking run at one of the most famous stadiums in the world. Princess Diana and Prince Charles attended the July 16th concert. Demand for the initial Wembley dates reportedly exceeded 1.5 million ticket requests, enough people to fill the massive stadium again and again. The Bad Tour became one of the defining touring achievements of its era. And when you watch the footage, it is easy to understand why. The stage looked less like a concert setup and more like a movie set. Songs that had begun as studio recordings, Smooth Criminal, Man in the Mirror, and Bad, were transformed into massive theatrical productions filled with complex lighting, props, and ensemble choreography. Every concert felt like a cinematic event unfolding live. Vincent Patterson, who had worked on some of Michael's most iconic visual performances, helped shape the live production. The band rehearsed intensely before the next stage of the tour began. Every movement had been considered. Every cue had been tested. Every detail had been refined. And once Michael Jackson stepped onto that stage, he appeared completely untouchable. But the audience could only see what happened under the lights. They had no idea what was happening the moment he walked off stage. Here is where the story becomes darker. Because the Bad Tour was not just physically demanding in the normal way a long tour is demanding. This was not simply about travel, rehearsals, lights, cameras, and exhaustion. Michael Jackson was performing 2-hour, high-intensity shows filled with full choreography while carrying a level of chronic physical pain that people close to his medical care later described as nerve pain coming from his scalp. That pain traced back to the surgeries he underwent after the 1984 Pepsi commercial accident. The injury had never fully disappeared. The nerve endings were still healing when the Bad Tour began in September 1987. To get through the performances, Michael was prescribed pain medication. Not once, not occasionally, but as part of the routine that allowed him to function on stage. Karen Fay, Michael's longtime personal makeup artist who traveled with him during the Bad Tour, later testified about this physical reality during the 2013 AEG live trial in Los Angeles. Her account was not about a tired performer pushing through a difficult schedule. It was about a man dealing with a serious medical condition while the world watched him perform like someone superhuman. That was the terrifying gap. The audience saw perfection. Backstage, his body was paying the price. And every night the tour continued, that price became heavier. Soon, the strain started showing in his voice. During the early American leg, Michael Jackson developed laryngitis in St. Louis. Anyone who listens closely to recordings from that period can hear the difference. Notes he would normally hit easily were being avoided. The higher parts of his voice were held back. His performance energy was being used to hide what his voice could no longer give. But he did not stop. He did not rest. He kept going. And many who have studied those recordings believe that continuing without proper recovery almost certainly made the vocal damage worse. Then, the cracks began appearing in the tour's schedule itself. In October 1987, planned concerts in Perth and Adelaide were cancelled. A planned New Zealand leg was also removed from the routing. Promoter Kevin Jacobson blamed financial staging costs, saying the original schedule would have required millions more to execute. That explanation may have been true, but those cancellations were also the first visible signs that the tour was not running as smoothly as the headlines made it look. Then, during the American second leg, 3 concerts in Tacoma, Washington were canceled after Michael came down with the flu. The man giving some of the most physically demanding performances of any artist alive was also a man whose body was quietly beginning to fight back. And then came a moment most people overlook. On March 2nd, 1988, at the 30th Grammy Awards at Radio City Music Hall in New York, Michael Jackson performed The Way You Make Me Feel and Man in the Mirror. The room rose to its feet. The biggest names in music stood and applauded him. From the outside, it looked like a coronation. But then Bad lost Album of the Year, the best-selling album of 1987, an album with 5 #1 singles, the follow-up to the biggest album ever made. People close to Michael said he did not speak about it publicly in a dramatic way, but those around him knew that night affected him deeply. Because what does a moment like that do to someone who is already exhausted, injured, and under impossible pressure? What does silent rejection do when the entire world expects you to be untouchable? By November 1988, the Bad Tour was entering its final stretch. The second American run was supposed to lead toward the closing dates before the entire machine finally came to an end. By that point, Michael had been on the road for around 14 months. He had performed before millions of people across 15 countries. He had delivered show after show at a level no other entertainer on earth could match. And he had done all of it while managing chronic pain, vocal strain, illness, and a painkiller dependency that remained quietly controlled by people around him. Then, during the first of 6 planned Los Angeles concerts in November 1988, his body finally made a decision no one in his camp could ignore. His vocal cords were severely swollen. The remaining 5 Los Angeles concerts could not continue as planned. They were postponed until January 1989. The tour that had looked unstoppable for more than a year was suddenly forced to stop. And the consequences came quickly. Greg Phillinganes, the musical director who had helped shape the sound of the Bad Tour, had to leave because the rescheduled January dates conflicted with his previous commitment to tour with Eric Clapton. John Barnes was brought in to replace him for the final shows. A major part of the tour's musical structure had been removed under pressure during the final weeks of a production that was already falling apart at the edges. But this moment was bigger than logistics. This was the point where everything became impossible to ignore. The swollen vocal cords in November 1988 were not random. They were the result of a body pushed beyond its limits for too long. A system of management, sponsors, promoters, and industry pressure had every reason to keep the machine moving, but very little reason to ask whether the man inside that machine was still okay. The tour finally ended on January 27, 1989, with the final Los Angeles concerts. Afterward, Michael immediately sought medical treatment for vocal cord nodules. His body needed professional treatment just to return to a basic level of function. And then came the statement that, in hindsight, says more than anyone realized at the time. At the end of the tour, Michael said this was intended to be his last tour as a performing artist. He wanted to move into filmmaking. He was finished with live performance. Read that again with everything now in mind. This was a man who had spent 16 months being quietly broken by the very thing the world celebrated him for. He was saying in the most public way he could, without fully admitting the cost, that he could not do it again. That statement was the real final act of the Bad Tour. Not the final song. Not the final bow. That statement. For years later, in November 1993, Michael Jackson stood in front of a camera at Neverland and told the world he was canceling the second leg of the Dangerous World Tour. He said he was entering treatment for dependency on pain medication. And the wording mattered. He did not describe it as something sudden. He said he had become increasingly dependent on painkillers. Increasingly. That means the problem had existed before 1993. It had been present during the years connected to the Bad Tour. It had been managed, hidden, and sustained by a medical and management structure that needed Michael functional enough to keep performing. At the time, much of the media connected his painkiller admission mainly to the 1993 allegations. But Michael's own words pointed to something deeper. He spoke about pain from reconstructive surgery. He spoke about physical and emotional exhaustion. He was describing a condition rooted in years of pain, performance pressure, and medication used to survive a schedule no human body was meant to endure forever. The Bad Tour grossed around $125 million. It earned major world records. It played to more than 4 million people across 15 countries. By every external measurement, it was one of the greatest touring achievements in music history. But behind those numbers, it also marked the beginning of a darker chain of events. Chronic pain, dependency, physical decline, and the psychological burden of performing through all of it while the world watched and called it magic. That pattern would follow Michael into later chapters of his life. The Dangerous Tour collapsed in 1993. The History Tour brought private concerns about his physical condition. And in 2009, the This Is It rehearsals became a documentary for reasons nobody involved ever wanted. Michael Jackson walked onto the Bad Tour stage and gave everything he had every night. He performed in cities that had never seen anything like him. He hit every mark. He nailed every cue. He protected the illusion of total invincibility across 123 concerts and 16 months. That was the story the world saw. the greatest show on earth. But what the story rarely included was the truth behind it. That show was being powered by a man who was being consumed by it, night after night. The Bad Tour did not destroy Michael Jackson in one single moment. But somewhere inside that run, there was a concert, a night, a breaking point where the direction of everything changed, where the cost became too much to hide, where his body began losing a silent fight it had been fighting since before the first show even began. And the real tragedy is not only that it happened, it is that the show was so extraordinary, so overwhelming, and so unlike anything the world had ever seen that almost nobody in the audience noticed what it was taking from him.